Hello, Mind Mappers, and welcome to the Learning Masterclass. This is an introduction to the course that I put together to help you drastically increase your learning ability and drastically decrease the amount of time that it takes you to learn any new skill. What I've done here is synthesized over 100 hours of my own personal reading from dozens of books from the world's experts on learning. As well as what I've done is throw a few of my own experiences in with the experiences of some of my coaching clients as well. Now, what we're going to do here inside this video is just give you a brief overview of what you can expect inside of the course. First, we're going to talk about what learning actually is, in my opinion. Here are a couple quotes that I pulled out that I think give us a good overview of what learning really is. Of course, the dictionary says it's the acquisition of knowledge or skills through experience, study, or by being taught. Josh Waitzkin, who is one of my favorite authors, says that it's the key to pursuing excellence is to embrace an organic, long-term learning process and not to live in a shell of static, safe mediocrity. Usually growth comes at the expense of previous comfort or safety. That gives you a little introduction to what we're going to be doing today. A lot of what we're talking about is getting rid of those old study habits that you have, getting rid of those old learning habits that you were taught, and turning you into a learning machine through some of the most impactful learning tools that I could possibly find in all of the books that I've read. Now, Benjamin Franklin said, "Tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn." And that's really what we're doing inside this course. Not only have I pulled out good quotes, not only have I pulled out time-tested advice from some of these authors, but what we're going to do is actually put this into play in your life. We're not going to be sitting on the sidelines. We're going to dive right into it. We're going to involve you so that you can learn how to learn. And of course, why is learning important? That's, of course, another thing that we need to look at before we actually dive directly into this. And it's my belief that whether you're a student right now or you're a person trying to move forward in their career or your business, and you're trying to stay ahead of your competition, learning, relearning, and doing it all in an efficient manner is extremely important, now more than ever. There's more information out there than ever in our world, and the skill of learning is going to be what keeps us ahead. Not the skill of knowing something already, but the ability to set out and learn something in a relatively quick and efficient manner is going to be what keeps you ahead of the competition, whether you're in a career or you're in business, or you're really just living your everyday life. And it's not all about achieving. Of course, you've listened to the channel before. Learning is not all about achieving. Goal setting is not all about achieving. Habits is not all about achieving. Really what it's about here is about, if you want to learn meditation, these techniques are going to help. If you want to learn how to be just a better partner in your relationships, these techniques are going to help. Do you want to learn a new language? These techniques are going to help. It's not all about achieving something in your career or in your business. Learning can help you in every area of your life. The goal of this course is to help you be a more efficient learner. This isn't about how to study for 14 hours a day. It's not what that is about. Instead, we're going to talk about what the science says is the best way for us to learn efficiently, meaning learning more in less time. That means if you want to study for 6 hours, great, you're going to get more out of those 6 hours. But what it also means is that if you want to study for 15 minutes in your day, between one meeting and the next meeting, or while you're drinking your coffee in the morning, or in replacing the 15 minutes that you would spend gossiping at lunch, these 15 minutes are going to be the most effective 15 minutes, and you're going to be able to get the most out of them if you use the techniques inside this course. And finally, let's talk about how this masterclass will work. If you haven't taken a course from me before, essentially what I've done is I've read what I believe to be some of the best books on learning. Books like A Mind for Numbers, How to Be a Straight A Student, The Procrastination Equation, Limitless, How We Learn, Make It Stick, The Art of Learning, Outliers, The Practicing Mind, and Hyperfocus. And then, of course, I do what I do. I pulled out the most practical, the skill-based, the timeless principles from those books and put them into a mind map. Of course, I've also added a few of my own experiences through my learning journey, taking me from someone who felt like they couldn't learn and did a really bad job inside of elementary school and inside of high school, to someone that basically learns for fun and someone that basically teaches other people how to learn for fun. And of course, I've also brought through some of the experiences from my coaching clients as well that I think you'll find very impactful. This course is for you. It's for you and your potential future. And the course is definitely for people who are looking to be better tomorrow than they were today. All of the techniques that we talked about are meant to be actually used. And that's what this class is really setting itself apart by. Everything that we're teaching here is not theory, it's something that we've practiced in the trenches. It's pulling out the principles from the books that can actually be used. Honing in on your learning skill via action, of course, is the name of the game. Don't just take notes here. Follow along with the mind map, which of course you'll get access to, and follow along with the exercises below. They're designed to make this masterclass stick. As all of my mind maps on my YouTube channel are, they're formatted in a very particular way to help you remember the points and be able to pull them into action when you need them the most during your everyday life. Before we shut this video off, this introduction off, let's talk a little bit about the points that we're going to be learning. Number one, we're going to talk about intensity. What's work accomplished actually mean? It means time times intensity. When, where, and how long? How intense should you be studying? We're going to talk about how to overcome procrastination via this really interesting equation. We're going to talk about mindset and how when you're putting in effort, it actually counts twice. We're going to talk about whether you think you can or you think you can't. You're actually right. Of course, we're going to talk about the Fluency Illusion. It's the number one enemy of effective learning. We need to overcome the Fluency Illusion if we're going to be an effective and efficient learner. Of course, we're going to talk about quiz time. What's the most important part of learning? Well, actually, it's the tests. You think you're studying for the tests, but the tests are actually the way that you study. This is all about how to learn faster. We're going to talk about varied practice. When we're baseball players, we don't want to just hit fast balls. We want to make sure that we're mixing the information up well, mixing up the mediums to get the best results. Our next point is about teach. Can you teach me, or can you explain it like I'm 5? For me, this is my most effective way of learning. Teaching other people is how I actually learn, so thanks for watching this video. Relax to remember. Our final point. Learning isn't always about being on full tension. Of course, we talked about intensity before, so tension is an important part of the process. But we want to make sure that we relax enough that we can remember. A very important part of learning that is often missed by people who haven't studied the learning literature. That's Learning Masterclass. Thanks for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you inside of the course. Let's talk about intensity. Intensity when it comes to learning. Not the first word that pops into your mind, most likely. But for me, intensity is equal to a simple formula that Cal Newport points out in his book, How to Be a Straight A Student. Work accomplished equals time invested times intensity. And Cal's going to be one of our main mentors today. We're going to learn from him how to learn. And he says this about learning intensity. In fact, when asked what one skill was most important in becoming a non-grind, straight-A student, most of them cited the ability to get work done quickly and with a minimum of wasted effort. So how do these students achieve this goal? A big part of the solution is actually timing. They gain efficiency by compressing work into focused bursts. To understand the power of this approach, consider the following simple formula. Work accomplished equals time spent times intensity of focus. And of course, when I said intensity and when I said learning, you were hoping, please don't let this be math. But of course, we need to do a little bit of math here. Work accomplished equals 100. With an intensity of 1, you're going to have to do 100 units of time spent, or 100 10 times 10. That means that if you put intensity on a scale of 1 to 10, which is kind of the best way to measure it, you can get 100 units of work done in either 100 hours or in 10 hours, just by controlling your intensity. That's a massive efficiency upgrade. Higher intensity means lower time invested, or more work done in the same amount of time. So whether you have 15 minutes in between a meeting, or whether you have 6 hours to learn, intensity is still the name of the game, either way, leaving you with more time to relax, learn other things, or do the job that you really need to do. Learning to work in focus bursts is an insane effectiveness hack. Not only this, but what I've noticed is it's really the only way to learn in a lasting way. Because our lives are so busy nowadays, unless we're in university and studying is our main job, we're simply not going to be able to keep up the pace that a university student would learn at. So we need to be able to learn in a quicker, more effective fashion. So what do focus bursts look like? First of all, it looks like shutting off all your distractions. Of course, we talk about this so much on the channel, but you have to shut off that phone, social media, emails. All of these things are going to absolutely wreck your ability to focus. Now, for sure, during the time that you're going to be doing your focus burst, you want to shut that off. And I would argue that you don't want to be looking at these things first thing in the morning because you're going to seriously impact the way that your brain interfaces with your own reality. If you're constantly looking at your phone, social media, and emails, you get into a reactive mode rather than a proactive mode. And I really think that for learning, we want to be set in that proactive mode. Learning for me is best done, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the where, when, how, but best done first thing in the morning without all these crazy distractions that we have nowadays. Next, it looks like having one single thing to focus on. You want to have a learning goal. Now, don't just go into a learning session without a goal. Make a decision on what you want to learn. And sometimes that can be difficult. As adults, we don't know. We just want to work on personal development. We just want to get a little smarter. But here's something that I think would be really good for everyone to adopt. I call it just-in-time learning. Most of my clients are business owners with challenging schedules and changing schedules, demanding work lives, demanding home lives. They have learning needs that change every day, but they're constantly present. This means that they often don't have the luxury of learning just to learn, just to read a book or just to do this or just to do that. They have to learn, and they have to do it during a busy schedule. To me, this is actually sneakily a helpful way to learn. When they have something to learn that they need to do just in time for a project or for a deliverable for a client or any of these things, they know exactly what they need to learn. They need to learn a new way to code. They need to learn a new way to write something. They need to learn graphic design. They need to figure something out, right? This gives them immediate feedback and it gives them a deadline. Really what that is it's giving you a single goal of something to focus on. But what if you're not in that position? Well, here are a couple ways that you could get around it. One thing you could do is create these projects for yourself and learn just in time for those projects. Let's say you want to learn how to speak Spanish. Plan to go to a Spanish restaurant and order only in Spanish in just 1 month. Set a date with your significant other and know that that's the day that you're going to have to actually know how to order something in Spanish. Do you want to learn how to code or do something in the technical realm? Sign yourself up on a freelancing platform. For a really low fee, tell people you're just learning, but you can learn as you go. You have set deadlines and you get a wide variety of new things that you're going to have to learn. The bonus is, hey, you get paid a little bit of money as you go. Each of these things pushes you into the real world. It gives you things that you know you need to focus on. And for me, that's much easier than trying to set a specific goal with your learning. Often you need some kind of that immediate real world feedback. After that, it's simply just the skill of staying focused, as we talked about before. This is something, unfortunately, a lot of us have, of course, lost. With our attention splintered constantly by day-to-day life, it's hard to stay focused on any one thing anymore. Really, it's hard. But here are the few tips that I think you could work into your daily life that would help you immensely with your intensity and with your focus. Number 1 is start a meditation practice. I mean, I sound like a broken record here. I talk about meditation all the time. But it turns out studying and meditation are the back on track muscle. They're using that back on track muscle in our minds. And you can actually train it, right? You start to get a little distracted while you're meditating. You got to bring the mind back on track. Get a little distracted while you're meditating. Bring the mind back on track. And it's essentially the same exact thing while you're studying. Tip number 2 is to play some focused music. Something instrumental and rhythmic without a whole lot of lyrics. That's going to really help you stay focused and get into that flow state. Tip number 3 is to take time in between intense learning sessions. I know I am definitely a culprit of this. Some of us try to do back to back days of intense learning. These intense focus sessions take a lot more energy out of you than the unfocused sessions that we're used to doing. So we need to respect our energy, take days off, take 15-minute breaks, And we're going to talk all about that in our next point, which is when, where, and for how long. All about intensity still. So when, where, and how long. The little things that count. This is especially true when it comes to studying. Before we get caught up in the details of exactly how to review and synthesize material, there are some basic questions that we must address first. When during the day should you study? When should you go to study? Where should you go to study? How long should you study before taking a break? The right answers will boost your productivity, allowing you to squeeze more work out of even less time. The wrong answers, of course, will slow you down and make this process more difficult than it needs to be. Straight A students, I found out, devote a lot of thought to these questions. They recognize how these seemingly little details can make or break their study efforts, and have experimented extensively to discover the most effective strategies. That's coming from Cal Newport again. These are the three most important questions we can ask ourselves when it comes to learning. When, where, and how long. They really look into the learning environment, which we tend to, of course, overlook, right? We're thinking, I just need to sit down with the book. When during the day should you study? Turns out Cal found some answers for us. Well, you should do it early in the day if you can, exactly as I said before. You want to get as much studying and intense work done as you can before you have to meet the demands of the day. That includes demands of social media, email, work, whatever it might be. For me, this course, the mind maps, and any other learning I do is done before I start work for the day. If I have to wake up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, that's when I do my learning. I need about an hour or 2 hours worth of doing these mind maps before I feel like I'm really inside of the flow. So if I start work at 9, I want to make sure that I'm up and working on the mind maps for probably 6 o'clock, taking a couple breaks in between. So where should you study? Something that you don't think about very often, but again, we need to do it in isolation as much as possible. We need to make sure that we're not having distractions. We need to set up our environment in a way that makes sure that we are not going to get distracted from what we're trying to learn. So this could be a dedicated room in your house or in your school, an office with a closed door. Just ensure that you have as little distraction as possible. And I think, of course, where should you study is one point, but let's look at your computer. Are you studying inside of a browser that has easy access to the internet, that has easy access to social media or email or a bunch of cat videos? You want to make sure that you keep that as a dedicated room as well. Shut off some of those distractions and etc. so that you can make sure that you're not getting distracted while you're supposed to be studying. And of course, the big question, how long should you study before taking a break? I mentioned that I do 3 hours of studying before I feel like I'm kind of done for the day, but really, you want to make sure that you're not actually studying for that long, right? Focused work drains our energy like almost nothing else. Taking frequent breaks allows us to recharge and bring ourselves back to the work. Cal recommends taking at least one break of 5 to 10 minutes every single hour. I personally am not following that advice. What I actually do, I set my timer for 45 minutes, and after that, I take a 15-minute break. I drink some water, I do a mini workout, do some push-ups, some squats, or maybe I'll just focus on my breathing, whatever I'm feeling like in that 15 minutes. I come back refreshed, and for that first 5 minutes, there's a little bit of pressure that I have to apply, but after you get past that first 5 minutes of coming back, you're back in and you're in that flow state and you're starting to learn again. That was intensity. Let's talk about everyone's favorite subject, procrastination, specifically how we can overcome procrastination when it comes to learning. And again, here we've got another great formula that can get us kicked off into how we can overcome procrastination. Expectancy times value divided by impulsiveness times delay. I call Pierce Steele a procrastination professional. He not only created that handy equation that we're going to talk about here today, but he's another one of our mentors that we're learning from all about learning. And there it is, the procrastination equation, inspired by the common elements that determine when we procrastinate and crafted together from some of the most deeply researched elements of social science's strongest motivation theories. The procrastination equation accounts for every major finding for procrastination. As the deadline for any task gets pushed further into the future, the delay increases, right? So we'll look over here at the equation again. We've got delay at the very bottom of the equation. Delay increases and our motivation to tackle the task decreases. Impulsiveness multiplies the effects of delay. So if you're impulsive and you have a long delay, good luck getting anything done. And so impulsive people feel the effects of time far less acutely, at least at first. Consequences have to be at their doorstep before they can start paying attention to them unless they're particularly large. And what makes consequences large? Well, their expectancy times their value. The bigger the payoff and the greater the likelihood of receiving it, the sooner it will capture your attention, even if you're a very impulsive person. So I love, again, when psychology can be broken down into a mathematical formula. We're seeing a lot of those being used today. Let's take a little bit of a deeper look here, right? We've got that expectancy times value / impulsiveness times delay, where expectancy is how confident are you in your ability to create whatever it is that you aspire to create. That's expectancy. And value, does whatever you're trying to create have real meaning to you? Or is it kind of not actually attached to what your real goals are? Impulsiveness, are you easily sidetracked via immediate gratification? Put your hand up, and I'm putting mine up as well if that's you. And delay, right? Delay is our last piece right here. It likes to move around in the mind map apparently. And what we're looking at is really how far in the future is your deadline? So what we need to think about is how do we actually optimize this formula? We need to increase our expectancy and value, right? So increase how confident we are in our ability to actually get something done. And we need to increase the value it has, the real intrinsic value it has to us. And of course, we want to decrease as much as possible our impulsiveness and our delay, right? Are we easily sidetracked? Do we get easily distracted, as we talked about before? How is our environment set up? How is our computer environment set up if we're using our computer quite often? Do you have distracting applications open, social media open? Are people in your environment distracting you? We need to bring that down. Delay. How far in the future is your deadline? Remember we talked about just-in-time learning? That's going to be the most effective way for us to decrease our delay, to make sure that when we're actually learning something, we can put it into practice immediately, which is a really good way to decrease your delay and increase your ability to overcome procrastination. So now a little bit of reflection time. Let's look at the last or the current project that you've been procrastinating on. Maybe you're procrastinating right now watching this course. What is your expectancy, right? How sure are you that you can achieve the project or whatever you're thinking about procrastinating on? How sure are you that you can actually achieve it? What is your value, right? So does this work have actual meaning to you? And have you even asked yourself that question? What is your impulsiveness? How likely are you to get distracted by instant gratification? This is the social media apps and etc. It's also the meditation that we talked about before, right? It's the skill of being able to focus. And then, of course, what is your delay? How long is this project going to take to complete? This book by Pierce Steele, I recommend if you're having a real problem with procrastination, that you go and check it out on the YouTube channel. It's kind of helping you balance the equation. That's really what it's all about. I've got another really great point about procrastination here that I want you to dive into, but if you're struggling deeply with procrastination, it probably is worth to revisit that book. Here we go. Solve the equation. Now what do we do? Timothy Cycle is our other procrastination mentor. We've got two of them here today. He says that just getting started is his number one tip for overcoming procrastination, and trust me, this is what actually works. Notice that we are not using the famous Nike slogan, just do it, about getting started. The doing it will take care of itself once you get going. If we think about just doing it, we risk getting overwhelmed with all there is to do, right? We have such a big project to do, we can't just do it, because by just doing it, we set into motion a huge chain of events that's going to take a heck of a lot of willpower. We risk getting overwhelmed with all that there is to do. If we just take the first step, that, on the other hand, is much easier. As a strategy, you may find that you have to get started many times throughout the day. Remember, I talked about that before with my 45 minutes, 15 minutes, right? That's getting started multiple times. I've got to get through that first 5 minutes of that 45-minute work chunk before I truly feel like I'm ready to go. This, of course, is common. It affects me, it affects the coaching clients, and I'm willing to bet it probably affects you. Even in meditation, we have to gently bring our attention back to our focal point, whatever that may be. The thing that we're going to remember is just that getting started may happen many times in a day. So really what he's saying here is we need to make sure that we're not worrying about necessarily accomplishing anything, right? Don't just think about doing it, think about just getting started. Just get started. Sounds pretty backwards, right? Of course, we have these big projects that we want to do. We want to accomplish them. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. But almost all personal development books focus on setting big goals and focusing your mind around them, which is not necessarily wrong, but what if that's hurting you just as much or more than it's helping you because you're getting overwhelmed with all there is to do? When we set these big, audacious goals, our minds see how much work there is going to be. I mean, it's no wonder that we don't want to get started and we procrastinate on things, right? We plan to work crazy hours, endure stress, or any number of things that we have planned for ourselves. And not only that, but when we're stepping outside of the actual doing piece, right? We've stepped outside of the actual work or of the learning. For some reason, our minds and our brains think that we can do way more than we've done in the past. And we set bigger goals than we can actually realistically accomplish. So, of course, here we are. He's talking about meditation. He's talking about all sorts of things. Should we resolve just to not get anything done? I find that people think that people who are meditators or do yoga and that sort of thing, quite often they just kind of resolve themselves not to get anything done. And that's simply just not the case. Defeats the purpose of overcoming procrastination, which is what we're here about right now. Instead, let's focus on just getting started. Focus on getting 5 minutes into the task. That's what I do with my timer. I turn it on, and all I have to do is get to 5 minutes. But once I'm at 5 minutes, it gives my mind enough time to switch states and actually get motivated, right? Motivation is actually kind of part of momentum. So you need to be willing to push through and start to gain a little bit of momentum, and then you're not going to actually procrastinate anymore. It's very interesting, but you have to get started before you even give procrastination any kind of credence, right? You need to get started, get 5 minutes into the task. This is the skill. It's definitely a skill. It's not something easy, right? The mind comes up with all sorts of reasons why you shouldn't just get started as well. Now, making it a little smaller, making it into 5 minutes certainly makes it easier, but the skill is starting again and starting again and starting again. Right? If you get off task, if you get distracted, if you start to procrastinate, the best time to start is right then. Start again, start again, start again. This leads to huge results. Quite often we think of people that accomplish great things as superhumans. They read entire books, perhaps, right? People think sometimes that I'm crazy for reading so many books, or for exercising, right? Or for people that we just look up to. We think that they have some sort of inhumane willpower that, of course, we can't have access to. But really what they're good at is overcoming procrastination by getting started over and over and over again and balancing this equation so it tips in their favor as much as they possibly can. Trust me, the coaching clients that are the most effective are the ones that know how to balance the equation and just get started again and again and again. That was procrastination, of course, stricken out because we're trying to overcome procrastination. Let's talk about mindset. Mindset when it comes to learning. This is an underrated topic when it comes to learning, I believe. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. This is coming from the guys who wrote Make It Stick, one of my favorite books on learning that I've done on the YouTube channel. But they're actually citing another amazing author, Carol Dweck. 4 mentors for the price of 1 here. We've got 3 different authors that wrote Make It Stick, and of course Carol Dweck wrote her own book called Mindset. Let's return to the old, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. It turns out there's more truth here than wit. Attitude counts for a lot. The studies of psychologist Carol Dweck have gotten huge attention for showing just how big an impact one simple conviction can have on learning and performance. The belief that your level of intellectual ability is not fixed but rests at a large degree in your own hands. Dweck's research has been triggered by her curiosity over why some people become helpless when they encounter challenges and fail at them, whereas others respond to failure by trying new strategies and redoubling their efforts. She found that a fundamental difference between the two responses lies in how a person attributes their failure. Those who attribute their failure to their own ability, I'm not intelligent, become helpless. Those who interpret failure as a result of inefficient effort or inefficient strategy dig deeper and try different approaches. So if we want to increase our abilities, our ability to learn, first we need to focus on changing our mind. What are your thoughts about your own abilities? It's a good time to reflect on that. This is something important that we need to keep in mind. But it's also something, of course, that we often ignore. Most of us have a running track of self-talk in our minds. A lot of it is actually negative. Carol points out in her book just how much that is actually hindering our ability. So, how might we overcome this negative self-talk that we all have kind of running in the background? Well, inside his book, What to Say When You Talk to Yourself by Dr. Shad Helmstetter, he gives us what I think is a good process, or as good a process as any. First, you need to be aware of the talk. You need to catch yourself in the act of saying, it's not up to me, or I'm failing because I'm just not intelligent enough, right? We need to catch ourselves in the act of giving ourselves an excuse or saying that we're limited in some way. Next, you need to know that it's not actually inherently true just because the voice inside your head is saying it, right? The voice inside our head says quite a lot of things, and quite often they're not actually true. Finally, we need to focus some time on reprogramming that voice inside our head through using self-talk to our advantage. I recommend that you check out the mind map on Dr. Shad Helmstetter's book, What to Say When You Talk to Yourself, for a little bit more info here. But in essence, here's what I do. First, coming back to it, meditation. Let's see what the mind is going to say when it has full reign. Right? Is it saying good things about myself? Is it saying bad things about myself and my abilities to learn, and etc.? If I'm noticing it saying, oh, I can't learn that because I can't learn how to code because I'm not that good at learning numbers, right? I know that I need to change that mindset. So I need to spend some time looking at my life. Look at times that I've been able to do things that I didn't think I was able to do. Kind of create a portfolio for myself to show myself that I have the ability to learn anything that I might need to learn. There we have it. Do you want to know what I think is the number one factor in learning ability? The belief that you can actually do it. A lot of my coaching clients come to me for help with procrastination. Mindset plays such a huge part there too. Motivation is a function of wanting something and believing that you can achieve it. So when it comes to learning, you need to make sure, okay, I want to learn this thing, but also, do I believe that I can? Another point on mindset here is that effort counts twice. This is coming from Angela Duckworth's book, Grit. Another mentor here, and she tells us that talent times effort equals skill, and skill times effort equals achievement. So if we're trying to achieve anything, another great formula here, you can see that inside this equation, effort counts twice. Here's the quote. I've been working on a theory of psychology of achievement since Marty scolded me for not having one. I have pages and pages of diagrams, filling more than a dozen lab notebooks. After more than a decade of thinking about it, sometimes alone and sometimes in partnership with close colleagues, I finally published an article in which I lay down 2 simple equations that explain how you get from talent to achievement. Again, it's talent times effort equals skill, and skill times effort equals achievement. Talent is how quickly your skills improve when you invest effort. Achievement is what happens when you take your acquired skills and use them. Of course, your opportunities, for example, having a great teacher matter tremendously too, and maybe more than anything about the individual. My theory doesn't address these outside forces, nor does it include luck. It's all about the psychology of achievement, but because psychology isn't all that matters, it's actually incomplete. Still, I think it's useful. What this theory says is that when you consider individuals in identical circumstances, what each achieves depends on just 2 things: talent and effort. Talent, how fast you can improve a skill, absolutely matters. But effort factors into the calculation twice, not once. Effort builds skill, and at the same time, effort makes skill productive. So we talked a little bit about here inside this quote how environment is so important, right? Having a great teacher, that sort of thing. And of course, we talked about environment inside of intensity, we talked about environment inside of procrastination, and here we are talking about environment inside of mindset, right? We need to set up our environment in a favorable way so that we can learn. But effort counts twice. We need to think again why effort is important. Angela points out here that psychology of achievement is not the only thing that plays into success, of course, right? But if you take these two individuals in the same situation, then effort is going to be the determining factor between someone that's successful and someone that's not successful. This, of course, is true now more than ever. We're on a much more even playing field. We have more information and access to that information than ever before. Effort is more important, in my opinion, now more than ever. And of course, effort is that force multiplier. Skill contains effort, and achievement also contains effort, which of course, achievement is what we're looking to do here inside of learning. Effort is a force multiplier because it counts twice. It's also, just so happens to be, the main thing in this equation inside of our control, right? We can't necessarily control whether we have a natural talent in what we're trying to learn, but we can control how much effort we put in. It's trainable as well. Almost endless quantity of effort is available. Effort secretly looks a heck of a lot like intensity. So, how much effort are you putting in? Angela quotes Will Smith inside of this chapter in her book. She says, "I've never really viewed myself as particularly talented. Where I excel is ridiculous, sickening work ethic. The only thing that I see that is distinctly different about me, I'm not afraid to die on the treadmill. I will not be outworked, period. You might have more talent than me. You might be smarter than me. You might be sexier than me. You might be all those things. You got it on me on all 9 categories. But if we get on the treadmill together, there's 2 things. You're getting off first, or I'm going to die." It's really that simple. And can you adopt that mindset? Again, we're talking about mindset here. You might need to put in a crazy amount of effort to learn something, especially if you're setting big goals for yourself like we talked about before. The treadmill here is really just an effort, or is just a metaphor for life. How much effort are you exerting when it comes to getting what you want out of it? And going back to what Carol says inside her book Mindset, how many times are you willing to get back up, right? It's kind of like the Rocky quote, right? It's not about how many times you go down, it's about how many times you can get back up. That's a big part of learning as well. You might learn for an entire day, study for an entire day, and realize that you studied the wrong thing, or you studied something that didn't end up being meaningful to you. You'll have to get back up and learn the new thing the next day. That was mindset. I think that is probably the most important point in our learning masterclass. Let's talk about the number one enemy of effective learning, the fluency illusion. This is probably something that you're falling into right now that if you could fix it, it would make a massive change in your ability to learn. And it comes again to us from the guys in Make It Stick, and they tell us that almost everyone falls into this trap. Learning is deeper and more durable when it's effortful. Learning that's easy is like writing in sand. It's here today and gone tomorrow. We are poor judges of when we're learning well and when we're not. When the going is harder and slower, it doesn't feel very productive. We are drawn to the strategies that feel more fruitful, unaware that the gains from these strategies are often temporary. Rereading text and mass practice of a skill or new knowledge are by far the preferred study strategies of learners of all stripes. But they're also among the least productive. By mass practice, we mean the single-minded, rapid-fire repetition of something you're trying to burn into your memory. The practice of conventional wisdom. Cramming for exams is, of course, one example. Rereading and mass practice gives rise to feelings of fluency that are taken to be signs of mastery. But for true mastery or durability, these strategies are largely a waste of time. So how many of us are spending all of our time doing this repetition, this practice of conventional wisdom that we're taught in school, cramming for exams, and doing other types of study techniques that just aren't that effective? Really, the question is, how fluent are you on a certain topic? Because especially after cramming for exams and writing those exams, when you get into the real world, cramming just isn't the way to go. You need to be fluent on the topic that you're learning about. Turns out, we're just not that good at estimating how fluent we really are. When we reread something, it gives us this feeling of familiarity, of, oh, I've seen that before. that can often mask as fluency. But when it comes time to take action on a certain piece of information, we of course need to be fluent and not familiar. So why is fluency actually important? Let's say our job is to make decisions. Most high-paying jobs involve making decisions every single day. That's actually what you get paid to do. Often you'll need to make decisions very quickly, without time to reference the material that you once read a long time ago in college. Being familiar with a topic can give you a false sense of security, that it can make you feel like you understand the topic when you really don't. It leaves you open to making decisions on bad information, which of course is going to lead you doing a bad job in the long run. This is true with business and with careers and etc. So how do we ensure that we're actually fluent with information so that we can make the best decisions possible? Start by throwing away most of the common study practices that we're using in today's day and age. Rereading a particular text, cramming the night before a test, and taking the same practice test over and over are simply not effective. Then we're going to add some of the practices inside this book directly into our learning. These practices end up being more energy and attention demanding, but they lead to real brain changes versus temporarily understanding a topic. So what we're saying here is we've got to put some effort in. We've got to use some things that we're going to talk about in this next point to overcome that fluency illusion. Yes, they're going to feel more difficult, they're going to feel slower, and it's going to feel like you don't know the topic as well as you would if you were under the guise that you had fluency in it, right? But to overcome that fluency illusion, we first need to look into overcoming or understanding that the fluency illusion is even a thing. So here's another take on the fluency illusion by Benedict Carey, another mentor that we're looking at here today. Let's recall Bjork's desirable difficulty principle. The harder your brain has to work to dig out a memory, the greater the increase in learning, retrieval, and storage strength. Fluency, then, is the flip side of the equation. The easier it is to call a fact to mind, the smaller the increase in learning. Repeating facts right after you study them gives you literally nothing. No added memory benefit. The fluency illusion is the primary culprit in below-average test performances. Not anxiety, not stupidity, not unfairness or bad luck, fluency. The best way to overcome this illusion and improve our testing skills is conveniently an effective strategy in its own right. The technique is actually testing itself. Yes, I am aware of how circular the logic appears. Better testing through testing. Don't be fooled. There's a lot more self-examination than you know. A test is not only a measurement tool, it alters what we remember and changes how we subsequently organize that knowledge in our minds. And it does so in a way that greatly improves later performance. So really what we're talking about here is getting it. Do you feel like when you're reading or rereading, you're feeling like you're getting it, right? That's not what it's all about. That feeling is just that perceived fluency that we've talked about so many times before. And it feels great, but it's very dangerous. Because repeating something directly after learning it is very easy to do. Anyone can do it. But remembering it long enough to put it on paper when you're tested or to integrate it into your daily life is definitely much different. Overcoming the fluency illusion means that we need to create some desirable difficulty in our study process. And the best way to do this is something that we're actually going to talk about a little later in more depth, testing ourselves. Close the book, the video, the course, and ask yourself, what chapter? What was that chapter about? What was that video about? What was that lesson about? In this one, you could go back and you could say, what was the few points inside of intensity? What were the few points inside of procrastination that I can remember? What are the few points inside of effort or mindset that I could remember and actually call back to my attention, right? Those are the things that we need to try and remember while we're actually learning, right? See if you can actively retrieve the information that you're learning. This is another really great point here, right? This will pop up and your fluency bubble is going to pop if you don't really know it. So if you try to call it back and you try to remember what you learned, it's going to be actually quite uncomfortable. You're going to have to call back, what was the first point of this mind map, right? What was intensity all about? What was the equation inside of intensity all about? What was the formula of the mindset part, right? What was the grit formula that we talked about? All those things. I create desirable difficulty by trying to recite my entire mind map video in my head on my 1 hour walk before I ever do the video. So I might make a mind map. I might read a book a week in advance of doing the actual video. I walk for an hour and I try and recite each point inside the mind map in my head before I actually do the video. This makes sure that I really know the material and I'm not going to forget something halfway through the video. But this is, of course, incredibly difficult, especially the first few times. And sometimes if I don't spend enough time with the material or if it's a new concept for me, I'm not going to be able to remember it. But that's one way that mind mapping can help you out, is if you force yourself to try and call back that thing to memory. That's probably the best way that I use mind mapping. It's just kind of, you collapse all of the points, and can you remember what the points before this point were, right? Can we remember that mindset came before this? Can we remember that procrastination was the one right afterwards? And can we remember that intensity was the very first point that we talked about? And also, can we remember what the main points inside of those nodes on the mind map were? That's how we can overcome the fluency illusion. The feeling that we are actually fluent in a subject when really we're just familiar is best overcome by actually testing ourselves, something we'll talk a little bit more about later. Okay, and now it's quiz time. The most important part of learning is actually the tests. Sounds counterintuitive, right? It's totally backwards. The things we're studying for are actually the things that we should use to study. A little bit more from Make It Stick again. You can't tell yet, but that's my favorite book on learning. A child stringing cranberries on a thread goes to hang them on the tree, only to find that they've slipped off the other end. Without the knot, there's no making a string. Without the knot, there's no necklace. There's no beaded purse, no magnificent tapestry. Retrieval ties the knots for memory. Repeated retrieval snugs it up and adds a loop to make it fast. Today we know from empirical research that practicing retrieval makes learning stick far better than re-exposure to the original material does. This is the testing effect, also known as the retrieval practice effect. To be most effective, retrieval must be repeated again and again in spaced out sessions so that the recall, rather than becoming a mindless recitation, requires some cognitive effort. Repeated recall appears to help memory consolidate into a cohesive representation in the brain and to strengthen and multiply the neural roots by which the knowledge can later be retrieved. So if we're looking to learn something, we've got to retrieve the information again and again. And this is kind of what we talked about in the previous points as well, is that retrieval and kind of taking the tests is really the most important part of learning. We need to actively recall again and again through spaced repetition what we're trying to learn in order to actually commit it to memory. So this is just the first strategy that we'll employ when trying to learn a new subject. Retrieval or remembering when you've read or listened to or watched without reference, this is really important. The action cinches up the knot of learning. Each time you retrieve something, it gets a little tighter and a little tighter. So how might that work, or how might it look in your own life? Well, when you're reading a book, try closing the book and try to remember what you just learned. What did the chapter before what you're reading right now mean, and what were some of the main points? When you're watching a video, you could pause the video and try to remember the main points. If you're watching the mind map, of course, you could do the same exact thing. What were the few points that came before this one, and what were the main ideas in each one of those points? Learning from a mentor. After the session, try to go over that conversation in your head multiple times, right? I speak with my coach, and I try not to forget the things that we talked about during the session, but a week later, I might reach back and I might say, what did we really talk about and what was helpful for me? And then the same thing, a couple days after that, I'll kind of retrieve that information and see, learning from a mentor, sometimes it takes on a whole different meaning based on what I'm experiencing at the time. So let's give this a try. What might this look like if we're trying to do? What were the main points from this video so far? So we talked, this is from the Make It Stick book, which I recommend that you go and check out, but the main points from the video so far, right after the introduction, what was the main point from the video so far? Right after the introduction, what did we talk about? And then after that first one, which if you didn't know was intensity, what was the next one? What was the next one that we looked at, right? What are some of the equations that were involved with that one? What was the thing that we're trying to overcome in that one? Well, of course, that one was procrastination. And continue on doing the same exact way. I'll scroll up for the rest of you just to see, and you can look at that again. We've got mindset and fluency illusion. But the idea here with mind mapping is it's so great because I can scroll away and recall that back to my memory, I can close the mind map and come back again and try and recall again and again and again. So that is essentially what we're trying to do, is overcome the fluency illusion. But what we're doing is testing ourselves again and again and again. Another point around quiz time is all about how to learn faster. And faster is, of course, an acronym coming from our mentor, Jim Quick. A really, really good book. His book, Limitless, is amazing. The acronym FASTER stands for Forget, Act, State, Teach, Enter, Review. Here's a breakdown. F is for forget. The key to laser focus is to remove or forget that which distracts you. Of course, he's talking about intensity here. A is for act. Traditional education has trained many people to learn. Learning is a passive experience. You sit quietly in class, you don't talk to your neighbor, and you consume the information. But learning is not a spectator sport. The human brain does not learn as much by consumption as it does by creation. S is for state. All learning is state dependent. Your state is currently a snapshot of your emotions. It is highly influenced by your thoughts, psychology, and the physical condition of your body, your physiology. T is for teach. If you want to cut your learning curve dramatically, learn with the intention of teaching the information to someone else. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but if you know you have to give a presentation on what you learn, you will approach how you learn the topic with the intention of mastering it well enough to explain it to someone else. E is for enter. What is the simplest and most powerful personal performance tool? Your calendar. We enter important things on our schedule. Do you know what a lot of people don't schedule? Their own personal growth and development. If it's not on your calendar, there's a good chance that it's never going to get done. And R, which is the main one we're looking at here, is for review. One of the best ways to reduce the effects of forgetting curve is to actively recall what you learn with spaced repetition. So here's how I use FASTER model inside of the mind maps and how you can do it too. F is for forget. Before each and every mind map, while reading, I do two things. I turn off my phone and all applications on my computer. We've talked about this so much already. I set a 30-minute, actually it's a 45-minute long Pomodoro timer. I used to do 30 minutes when I was building up, but now it's on to 45 minutes. And that's something that you can do as well, is start with 15 minutes and a Pomodoro timer, then go to 20, 50, 25, 30, and move up slowly as you get better and better at focusing. A is for act. Mind mapping actually builds the acting into the process of learning. While you're reading and taking notes, you move the nodes around and fit them into different spots into the mind map, make them actionable rather than just lines on a page, and that's why I love mind mapping so much. S is for state, right? Music. This is, for me, is huge. This is super important. Each time I start the Pomodoro timer, I also hit the music playlist. It's all instrumental and gets me into a focused and flow state. T is for teach. Of course, this is the most important part of the videos for me. What I do is actually teaching you guys. So while I'm reading the books, I actually think, how could I teach this concept? How does this connect to some of the other things that we've been learning on the channel? I didn't realize this until recently, but now that I see it everywhere. I even remember what I read better if I mouth the words as I read and try and do a brief summary at the end of each chapter. I actually do that. I recommend that you give it a try. E is for enter. These videos are a perfect example of entering. Each week, I am committed to making one video, and I actually have recently committed to making 2 videos every single week. That's 2 books every week, something not many people are willing to commit to. But because I entered it into my calendar and entered it into the YouTube algorithm, I guess you could say, really for me, this is the most commitment that I've made to any particular learning endeavor in my life. It's heads and tails made me feel so much more fluent in all of this information because I'm revisiting not the same concepts, but similar concepts every single week. And then, of course, R is for review. Saving the mind maps and coming back to them, for me, is very, very important. That's why I have a whole Google Drive full of them. But one of the other things of review I do, actually, we talked about before. Inside the mind maps, I'm actually recalling how the book I'm reading connects to other books. So what I've done recently is actually connected a bunch of books all together. I pick a particular topic that I'm trying to learn. Let's say it's habits, which is the one that's coming up next. And I'll read a bunch of books on habits all in the same month. And some of the points will be the same and some of the points will be different. But I need to actively recall how they kind of connect together. And that's all about quiz time. If you're trying to learn something, you need to make sure that you're testing yourself. And when you're testing yourself, it's best to do it with spaced repetition to decrease the fluency illusion. Now let's talk about another learning practice, which is varied practice, right? We want to make sure that we're varying the way that we're taking in information, varying the way that we're studying, because if we get really used to the same way that we're studying every single time, it becomes easy. And remember, easy leads to the fluency illusion. If you are not making difficult choices while you're studying, if you're not making it at least a little bit desirably difficult, you're going to fall into the trap of the fluency illusion. So this is where varied practice comes in. Again, it's coming directly out of Make It Stick, and essentially the quote goes like this. When the baseball players at Cal Poly practiced the curveball after curveball over 15 pitches, it became easier for them to remember the perceptions and responses they needed for that type of pitch. The look of the ball's spin, how the ball changed direction, how fast its direction changed, and how long to wait for it to curve. Performance improved, but the growing ease of recalling those perceptions and responses led to little durable learning. It is one skill to hit a curveball when you know a curveball will be thrown. It's a different skill to hit a curveball when you don't know it's coming. Baseball players need to build the latter skill, but they often practice the former, which, being a form of mass practice, builds performance gains only on short-term memory. It was more challenging for the Cal Poly batters to retrieve the necessary skills when practice involved random pitches. Meeting that challenge made the performance gains painfully slow, but also long-lasting. So, again, these short-term impediments make for stronger learning. Desirable difficulties is what they call it. When we're learning something new, we often want to make the process as easy as possible. Of course, we try and make everything as easy as possible in most of our lives. Today, outside of school, this looks like learning via following a YouTube video step by step. And of course, YouTube is an amazing tool. But just because we've been able to follow a video doesn't mean we actually know the thing. And that's what I'm trying to show you guys here as well while you're following the videos. Play along, move around, use the mind map. This opens up an interesting line of thinking, of course. When do we know something and when do we just need to get something done, right? They're two different things. I often think of this like a programmer would. If you have to do it twice, it's better to write the code to do it. So if you're doing something once, you don't need to bother to take the time to learn it deeply or practice it in a more difficult, less tutorial video type way. It's not a good time investment. By the way, a lot of the topics that we're talking about here today, these are not single uses. You're going to be using these every day of your life. So it's very important to know these from first principles. But if you're planning to do it more than once, it will be worth it in the long run to learn the subject deeply or the skill deeply. Perhaps by learning it deeply, you'll spot something you otherwise wouldn't have seen as well. Maybe it's a more efficient way to do a task. Maybe the task isn't necessary at all. Or perhaps you could create a product or service from the task and add it to your offerings if you're in business for yourself. Now, what does this look like in the real world? Instead of practicing something via repetition, we want to make things that are just a little bit more difficult. Often we'll watch a video of how to do something step by step and just follow along with the video versus shutting off the video and starting from scratch. When I first started my advertising business, I wanted to learn everything from scratch. I wanted to learn graphic design, copywriting, paid advertising, split testing, landing page building, offer creation, and email marketing. Even if I wasn't going to be the best person to do that job long term, it gave me the most comprehensive look into everything that the company did, which is extremely valuable long term, and I can say that this has paid itself back in spades over my career. Even though it was extremely frustrating at first, learning how to do the ins and outs of everything, I started exactly from scratch, and I tend to believe that that's a good way to get your learning going, is simply start right from scratch and make it as difficult as you possibly can. Do a bunch of different things and learn all the way around a problem rather than just kind of practicing the exact same thing time after time after time after time, because through varied practice is when you really learn things, right? So what we're talking about here really is this idea of just mix well for best results, right? Varied learners are the people that are going to be able to learn the best. Benedict Carey tells us how mixing up our practice overcomes the fluency illusion. It's not that repetitive practice is necessarily bad in and of itself. We all need a certain amount of it to become familiar with any new skill or material. But repetition creates a powerful illusion, right? That fluency illusion that we talked about before. Skills improve quickly, but then they flatten off, they plateau. By contrast, varied practice produces a slower apparent rate of improvement in each single practice session, but a greater accumulation of skill and learning over time. In the long term, repeated practice on one skill slows us down. So don't practice your skills one at a time is really what we're talking about here, right? It's another way to create a level of desirable difficulty in your studying techniques. Are you trying to learn more than one thing at a time? Well, don't focus on one subject until completion, right? Switch between the two different subjects. Bonus points if you try to look at the what if level of learning. So the what if level of learning for me is, how does this point in this one subject, let's say we're learning computer programming, how does computer programming relate to habits in my life, right? And the way they would relate, by the way, is kind of the formulas that we came up with today. Putting self-help, personal development, whatever you want to call it, concepts into formulas is kind of the intersection between the two different things that you might want to learn. If you're trying to learn one specific thing, try to learn it using as many different mediums as possible in different places as well, right? How I use this. So I'm a very, very non-linear thinker. That's why I love mind maps. I totally sucked in school. They always want you to study one thing until you know that thing inside and out, and there's a very specific path that you're supposed to follow. And to me, that just never seemed interesting. In fact, it was probably really boring. So now what I do is I say, okay, I want to learn about several different topics. I want to learn about health, mind and emotion, business, relationships, finances, social life, spirituality, probably a bunch more. But then I split that into the books that I think might be interesting on that topic, right? And after that, I switch back and forth between the topics. Sometimes you'll notice me quoting a health book on a mind map about a business book. Well, this is me attempting to create a framework to think from that is diverse. And when I can see the way in one of these different disciplines, let's call them, then I can see the way in a lot of other disciplines, right? You can relate back and forth. And that only happens through varied practice. And I think that is probably the number one way to just have a totally well-rounded, well-versed look at all the different things that you might want to learn is through varied practice. Another one of my favorite points in the mind map, varied practice. Now let's talk about teaching. Another one of our super powered high octane tools that people don't often use when they're learning. But really what we're talking about here is, can we teach it to someone? This is the last thing coming from Benedict today in his book, How We Learn. Many teachers have said that you don't really know a topic until you've had to teach it, until you have to make it clear to someone else. And that's exactly right. One very effective way to think of self-examination is to say, okay, I've studied this stuff. Now it's time to tell my brothers or spouse or teenage daughter what it all means. If necessary, I write it down from memory, as coherently, succinctly, and clearly as I possibly can. Remember, these apparently simple attempts to communicate what you learn to yourself or to others are not merely a form of self-testing in the conventional sense, but they're actually studying, the high-octane kind, the 20 to 30% more powerful than if you continued sitting on your butt and staring at the outline. So just by teaching, we increase our ability to remember and to retain the information by 20 to 30%. That's a huge, huge increase in retention. Better yet, those exercises will dispel the fluency illusion. Again, what we've been talking about all mind map long is how we get over that fluency illusion. They'll expose where you're confused and what you've forgotten, and really, really quickly. And that's the benefit of teaching it to other people. And I think I just wanted to take a quick second here and say that there's an interesting phenomenon where we feel like we need to know something super in-depth in order to be able to teach it. And while I think that's true in high levels such as schools, business, and paid coaching, it's simply not true in life. With my coaching and my courses, I wouldn't put anything out there that I hadn't studied extensively, but with my YouTube videos, I might only pass through the book one time and have a cursory knowledge of everything going on. It's certainly not as in-depth as perhaps even the person that wrote the book might be understanding the information. But after I've read a dozen or 24 books on a particular topic, I feel like it's okay to ask for money to be able to be teaching this to you guys. But really what the YouTube channel is for me is just learning so much from the teaching, right? I'm reading the book and I'm knowing that I have to give that book to you guys in a way that you're going to be able to easily understand and digest. It's really trying to formulate things in my own mind in order to help articulate it to people. We can learn what we don't know. I can easily point out if I'm halfway through a mind map and I get confused about something, I can go back to the book and I can reference that part of the book and I know what I don't know. And that's so helpful when it comes to learning. And this is how you can be a teacher, right? I want you to take this into your own life, become a teacher in your own life. You can use the learning techniques that we've talked about all throughout this course. You can create some sort of work, which might be a mind map, a thought structure, a presentation. It could be just a simple writing on a piece of paper like Benedict talked about above. And then I want you to go and take it and teach it to someone. Anyone who is willing to listen, even if it's only you. Teach it back to yourself. I've remembered so much more from the books that I've taught you than I ever would have if I didn't create the videos. And while I might get a couple of hundred views on a video now, you have to remember back in the day when it was just my mom and me watching the videos and no one was leaving any comments. So I was actually teaching to no one for a very long time. The next point here about teaching is another point that I just love, and it's called Explain It Like I'm 5. Barbara Oakley, again in her amazing book, A Mind for Numbers, gives us this gem. The legendary Charles Darwin would do much the same thing when trying to explain a concept. He imagined someone had just walked into his study. He would put down his pen and try to explain the idea in its simplest terms. That helped him figure out how he would describe the concept in print. Along those same lines, the website reddit.com has a section called Explain Like I'm 5, where anyone can make a post asking for a simple explanation of a complex topic. You may think that you really have to understand something in order to explain it, but observe what happens when you're talking to other people about what you are studying. You'll be surprised to see how often understanding actually arises as a consequence of attempts to explain to others and yourself, rather than the explanation arising out of your previous understanding. This is why teachers so often say that the first time they ever really understood a topic is when they had to teach it. Again, what I think we're trying to get at here is that understanding arises as a consequence of explaining, rather than vice versa. Just as often as you explain something you know, you actually learn something while you're explaining. So, of course, we often think the opposite. Teachers should know everything about a topic before they even start teaching it. And actually, this way it makes a heck of a lot more sense. Only by teaching do we uncover what we don't actually know. When you know a lot about a topic, it's easy to take pieces of it for granted instead of knowing everything from first principles. If you know a topic, nowadays especially, you kind of have memorized certain pieces of the topic, and you might have taken other pieces of it for granted. So this is why Explain Like I'm 5 comes into play, right? Why do we want to explain it like we're 5? We don't want to teach it like we're teaching someone at the same level as we are, but the more complex an idea is, the easier it is to memorize something and not truly understand it. It's a sneaky little thing. The more complex an idea gets, the easier it is for you just to take the idea for granted and have it memorized. But if you want to build a truly steady base of knowledge in everything you have from start to the base, if you had to explain it to a 5-year-old, you would be forced to start from that first principle versus taking the memorization of the information for granted. And this comes out in math class when you're just a kid as well, right? Why do they ask you to show your work? Because they want to make sure that you got there in the correct way. They don't even necessarily care so much that you got the right answer because, of course, we all now have calculators. But they want to make sure that your process was correct, that you started with the first step and you ended with the last step that gave you the right answer. So, what's a 5-year-old's favorite word? Well, of course, it's the word why. It's a great exercise that you can actually use, the 5-year-old saying why does that happen, why is that like this, that sort of thing. A great exercise that you can do when you're learning is to ask yourself why 5 times in a row. This makes sure that you know the topic from first principles versus memorization. So let's say you're talking about mind mapping and why it's more effective than regular learning. If you asked yourself why it was effective 5 times, you would get to the core, you would get to the base, or at least you would get as close as you possibly could to the base of why mind mapping is more effective than just traditional note-taking. And that's how I would approach any idea that I was trying to teach. Bring it down 5 times. Why is that the way that it is? Why is that the way that it is? And if you continue along that path, it brings you to the first principles. It makes sure that you know each piece of the information all the way from the base rather than a memorized piece of knowledge. And that's why teaching is so important to the learning process. Let's talk about relaxing. Of course, not a topic that you might think of when learning comes to mind, but in order to remember something, we actually have to relax. So learning isn't always done at full tension, and if we haven't explained that all the way through in this mind map, I don't know what we've been talking about this whole time. Learning is not always done at full tension. In fact, the most of the learning happens not at full tension. It happens when we're relaxed. Chris Bailey shares inside his book Hyperfocus, a different state of learning, which he calls scatterfocus. Hyperfocus, what we've talked about before inside of intensity and etc., can help you get an extraordinary amount done in a relatively short period of time. Again, back to that effectiveness piece that we've been talking about so much. Scatterfocus, on the other hand, lets you connect ideas, which helps you unearth hidden insights, become more creative, plan for the future, and of course, to rest. Together, they will enable you to work and live with a purpose. Your attention is the most powerful tool at your disposal to live and work with greater productivity, creativity, and purpose. Managing it well will enable you to spend more time and energy on your most purposeful tasks and to work more often with intention, focus for longer periods, and stumble into fewer unwanted daydreams. And I hope you spend it wisely. So scatterfocus is actually the final point of this book, and I'm really glad it was added. The whole entire book is talking a lot about the different things that Cal had talked about earlier on in our mind map. Intensity, our mindset, just when, where, how long. That's really what hyperfocus is all about. Of course, it's a really great book, but my favorite point was scatterfocus, this other mode that our minds get into. Life isn't all about getting straight into getting things done. We need to make time and space for connecting the dots that seem currently unconnected. Scatterfocus, for me, whatever you wanted to call it, happens when I'm out on a walk. That's the best time for scatterfocus. I let my mind wander around a particular point in my life. Maybe it's something going on in my business, my relationships, my health, or my happiness. Perhaps it's even connected to some of the books that I've been reading recently. But instead of having an intention, like I would when I'm sitting down and when, where, howing the intensity of my studying, I simply allow what comes up to come up. That's what scatterfocus is all about. After spending time in scatterfocus, I tend to have an idea for a project or something to work on. And that's really when I dive into new projects. I dive into new subjects that I'm interested in. It's when I make connections between a book in business and a book in health, or a book on mindfulness and a book on relationships. That's when I make connections that seemingly aren't there in the now. And if you want a high quality life, I think you need to pay attention to your attention and know what mode to use. How often are you spending time inside of scatterfocus or hyperfocus? Of course, Cal talked about how you need to take frequent breaks, but I also think that you need to take more infrequent long-term breaks, hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, in your schedule where you're just spending time inside of scatterfocus. You're not listening to a podcast, you're not watching a video, you're not reading a book, you're not studying anything that has to do with anything that you're trying to accomplish. Instead, what you're doing is allowing your brain to go where it wants to go. You could call this setting up camp. This one again is coming from Barbara again. One way to think of the diffuse mode is as base stations when you're climbing the mountain. Base stations are essentially resting spots in the long journey to difficult mountaintops. Diffuse mode, by the way, is Barbara's word for scatterfocus, essentially the same thing. You use them to pause, reflect, check your gear, and make sure you've got the right route picked out. But you would never confuse a resting at the base station with the hard work of getting to the top of the mountain. In other words, Just using your diffuse mode doesn't mean you can lollygag around and expect to get anywhere. Of course, we want to relax. We want to use scatter focus in the diffuse mode, but we want to be careful we don't get stuck there. As the days and weeks pass, it's the distributed practice, the periods of intensity, the periods of hyper-focus. It's the distributed practice, the back and forth between the focused mode attention and the diffuse mode relaxation that actually does the trick. We need to be able to flip back and forth between these two different modes in our mind to truly remember and to truly learn. And I love this analogy of learning being like climbing a mountain. There are times, of course, when we need to rest. That's the diffuse mode. This is like taking your mind off the topic that you're currently studying, letting the subconscious mind connect the dots. Things like going for a walk, as I said before, but also taking a nap, having a shower, are all great examples of this. You should find your own. Do you ever wonder why your best ideas come to you in the shower or on a walk? That's why. You're stopping to take a breather and allow the connections to be made. And of course, we need times when we're going to actually lug ourselves up the mountain, which we've talked about quite a lot already inside of this mind map. But this is where you're going to do the hard work of learning, studying, reading, listening, or watching material on our subject of choice. In order to make connections, we first need to have points to connect. Information we learn, ideally during focused study sessions. So, how are you currently at keeping the balance between hyperfocus and scatter focus, between focused mode and diffuse mode, between intensity and relaxation? Everest, of course, can't be climbed in a single day. It probably can't be climbed in a single week. It might actually take months. I'm going to look that up after this video. You actually need scheduled breaks just to survive up there. Are you scheduling breaks for diffuse mode or relaxation in your thinking, in your studying? Taking walks, meditating, or just straight up lying down can lead to some serious connections being made in your mind. And the reason that I'm kind of emphasizing this at the end of the course here is I believe that so many of us out there that are hard charging, wanting to learn something new, and honestly are just watching my YouTube channel can sometimes be a little neurotic. We can sometimes be too focused on self-improvement and not focused enough on relaxation. Of course, there's going to be a heck of a lot of climbing going on. Hard work is necessary. It's part of the game. No one is saying you can diffuse your way into competence in any subject. Just knowing that there are two different modes gives us something, though. It allows us to focus harder for shorter periods of time. And again, Cal talked about that in the beginning of the course, taking short breaks in between longer study sessions. But here we're more talking about longer breaks more infrequently. Taking a day off every once in a while, taking an hour off when you're studying, that sort of things. Of course, knowing that we can take a nap after a couple of hours or that we're not going to have to study quite as hard the next day can do wonders for our focus in the moment. That's what this is really all about. And that was relax to remember. One of my favorite points. I'm glad that I saved that to the end of the mind map. I want to thank you for being with me all the way through the course. And of course, I'm going to be continually adding new topics inside of the course as well. So continue to check back. I'm glad that you finished. I would love to hear from you. You can send me an email about what your favorite part of the mind map was. And if you're interested at all and you think that you have a great point that I should add to the mind map, by all means, reach out and let me know something that you've learned along your journey about learning, and I would be happy to add it to the mind map. Thanks so much, and we'll see you in the next Masterclass.